Hey everyone, this is Matt from Alanis Business Academy. In this lesson, we're going to talk about the external business environment. And this topic, I actually gave a lecture on a few days ago in my Intro to Business class and thought I'd take the opportunity to update some of the resources that we have related to this topic. We do have a few videos available on the external business environment. They were done several years ago and frankly with some older technology that we had at the time. So I thought I'd take this time to update that and give us a brand new video and that sort of thing. So hopefully you find the information valuable, of course. So let's start by going into what is the external business environment. Frankly, the external business environment is anything outside of the control of a business of some kind that has the potential to affect it in some way. So we operate under the assumption that as individuals, but also as businesses, we can control very little. There's a lot that happens outside of our control. So the mindset then shifts to, well, if I can't necessarily control these things, the best that I can do is try to pay attention and predict them. And if I can potentially predict them, then adapt to them, obviously, before they become an issue to where they're negatively affecting my business. And that really is the goal, is to try to make some changes so that we're not necessarily caught flat-footed and we can make those adjustments. So whether it be a change in price or whether it's a competitor that's doing something that could potentially affect our business, if we have some type of idea that potentially can happen, then we can take some actions necessary to try to lessen the impact of it. That's really the goal here, is not trying to change or prevent these trends from happening, but if we can at least anticipate them, trying to adapt to them beforehand. And if there are opportunities, then obviously trying to leverage those as well. And we'll talk a little bit about that once we get a little further along here in the video. So the first thing that we need to do is talk about the different environments, almost like sub-environments within the external business environment. And obviously we're talking about anything outside of the control of the business, but that's pretty vague in general. And so it becomes very difficult to try and analyze everything that could potentially affect your business. And so what we've done is we separate these into 6 environments just for the purpose of doing research so that we can make sure and consider some really important things here. The first of those, and this is really in no apparent order, I'll go ahead and list them first and then we'll talk about them a little bit, is the economic environment. We have the social environment, the technological environment, the competitive environment, the political and legal environment, and lastly, the global environment. So these are 6 environments altogether, each of which has the potential to affect the business in some way. So let's go through and talk about each of these. I'll give you kind of a quick definition, at least in terms of the way that I would describe it. And then I'll give you an example of maybe a change or a trend that could be important to some businesses. Maybe not all businesses, because remember, we're talking about a business's unique external business environment. So although there might be some factors like the economy that affects all businesses in a pretty similar way, it still doesn't affect them in an identical fashion, if that makes any sense. So let's first talk about the economic environment. When I say economic environment, what I'm referring to is the condition of the economy where the business primarily operates. So wherever the business primarily derives its revenues, we're talking about the condition of that economy. So if we have a business that operates primarily in the United States, and that's where a bulk of its revenues are derived from, then the United States economy would be its economic environment. And so what we're really concerned about here is the health and the condition of that economy. So really, the key question is, how are consumers doing in the economy? We want to know what are their habits, what are their purchasing habits, but also what are things like unemployment, what is GDP. We're looking at economic metrics to get a sense for the health of the consumer, because as you know, the majority of the growth in the economy is derived from consumer spending. So if consumers aren't spending money, then that will affect the health of the economy. If consumers' wages have been declining or inflation is continuing to rise, that could potentially affect consumer purchasing power. It affects the amount of money that they actually have in their possession, which will mean that they're less likely to purchase certain goods and services, right? Kind of stick to necessities. And we saw this happen in the latest recession in 2008, 2009, where people really did start to buckle down on saving, try to eliminate debt, because they were just concerned and fearful for what the future was going to hold. And so those are things that as a business, you would want to pay attention to, especially if your consumer is suffering rather significantly. Even in recessions, even during difficult economic times, not everyone suffers the same way. So you need to understand what your consumer is and how they're doing financially. But unfortunately, if you're not paying attention to what is going on in the economic environment, then you might be creating products that consumers don't have a need for at that point in time. Maybe they're outside of the price range that consumers can afford at that point in time. So those are important things to consider in that particular area. Now, the next environment is the social environment. The social environment includes changes in demographics, in consumer preferences, interests, and even lifestyles within a particular society. And so, like all things, from a business perspective, we're looking for potential changes or trends that might lead to some type of advantage if I could potentially leverage. So a couple of things to consider here in this area. The first thing is there's been a significant trend towards trying to have a healthier lifestyle. And this overall is a good trend, right? From a societal standpoint, we generally want people who are healthier because that affects ultimately healthcare costs and those types of things. And, it's better to have a healthier society versus the opposite. So that's certainly a good thing. And we've seen opportunities as a result of that. So as people desire to eat healthier, we've seen businesses adapt to that to try to leverage that particular opportunity. So this includes everything from portion control, where we've seen a lot of businesses that are now lessening the amount of food that they include, whether that's prepackaged, whether that's on a restaurant menu. We've seen those kind of light options, if you will. And those are a direct result of trying to cater to a group of consumers that wants healthier options. We've seen even companies like McDonald's, who have historically been known for obviously being kind of the opposite of a healthy lifestyle, even start to adapt their offerings in an attempt to cater towards a different consumer. Now, regardless if that's effective or not from a McDonald's standpoint, you certainly can't argue that they're trying to cater towards this healthier lifestyle. So those are things that you would look for. In changing demographics, one that is particularly kind of significant now, at least in the US, is obviously the baby boomers who are continuing to age and getting close to retirement. That is a significant opportunity as well. And as we've talked about before, that creates opportunities for different services related to retirement homes and other things that are in necessity as people get older, especially when you have such a large number of people that are getting older in a very similar time frame as well. Now, the next thing is the technological environment. And the technological environment involves changes in technology that can potentially add value to consumers. So from a business perspective, what I'm looking at here is if there is a change in technology that will allow me to provide a product or service that can help people, essentially. That's really at its core. A function of a business is to provide value. And if they're not providing value, then ultimately that's going to affect the success of the business. So let me give you a couple of examples to talk about some changes with regards to technology and how that's affected the environment and how we've seen. So one of those changes first that I'll mention is with regards to digital books. And this is not such a recent trend so much as what the mid 2000s, but some companies were able to leverage this change rather successfully, while others weren't necessarily. And so the companies I'll name are one being Amazon and the other being Borders. Now, Amazon, as we know, started off selling physical books solely and has since branched out into pretty much every possible item that you could purchase, but was originally a big pioneer behind this digital books technology. They came out with the Kindle in the mid 2000s and were really one of the early adopters, even when a lot of businesses didn't think that digital books would really be that big of a deal. Why would you want a physical book in your possession, or why would you want a digital book rather? Why wouldn't you want a physical book that you can open? It has a physical form, you own it, and those sorts of things. And that really affected the extent to which they adopted that particular technology. It was rather late until they developed their own dedicated e-reader. And by that time, Amazon had already had a dominant foothold. So those are some changes that Amazon saw, and that could potentially be an opportunity as a way of providing content to people in a way that's rather convenient, right? You don't have to lug books around. You can carry quite a few in an e-reader or an iPad or some other tablet. And so it provides a great deal of value. The other thing that I'll mention is with regards to travel and to car services. Uber is a relatively newer company. I think they were established in 2010 or 11, if I'm not mistaken. And personally, I really enjoy the service. I've used it a couple of times, more than a few. When I travel, I typically use it, and it's very convenient. If you're not familiar with the service, really how it works, and just so you know, kind of disclaimer, I don't work for them or anything like that. I'm merely a very, very happy customer. How the service works, just so you know, is you basically sign online, create an account, store your credit card information within an app, and then you actually use an app to call a car to your current location. And if you're kind of concerned that sounds a little bit creepy, a photo of the driver shows up, information on the car they're driving shows up, so you know exactly who to expect to come pick you up. It's not just some random person, obviously. And that person shows up, they ask for your destination, they take you there, and the payment is all handled behind the scenes. And so if you really don't like fumbling with, making sure you have the right bills to go in a taxi, trying to hail a taxi cab for the most part, which is rather difficult depending upon where you are, and standing outside forever, it really is a rather convenient solution that, one, leverages technology in the form of mobile technology. So we're kind of obviously getting in that area, but really enhances and provides value because it's just so much more convenient now. And the experience of getting a car and traveling from point A to point B is relatively easy, especially considering if you've had a lot of experience in taxi cabs and fumbling with payments and figuring all that stuff out. So those would be some examples of changes in terms of technology and how businesses have used them to really provide value to customers, which is really important. So once again, going back to, from a business perspective, what do? Our goal is to try to anticipate these changes and then leverage them to provide value. Another environment here within the external business environment is the competitive environment. Now, the competitive environment covers actions or competitor actions that pose a potential threat to another company. So one of the big things, obviously, for many companies is to be aware of what its competition is doing, because a number of different things, one of which is that if they create a product or a service that could potentially have an effect on your sales or anything related to that, then that could be very, very difficult to sustain long term. And so we've seen a lot of competition within the last several years. We've seen Apple and Samsung go head to head with regards to patents in pretty much every geographic area. We've seen a number of different companies, particularly Uber and Lyft, which is a similar car service as well, not as big in terms of revenues and financial support, but provides a very similar service. Also, in this particular environment where you have them offering almost identical services and coming out with those services at very, very similar times. In large part, that's because of this competitive environment, because they know if one of them is going to offer that service, it would really put them at a disadvantage if they weren't, especially considering it's a relatively new market. So there's no telling which is going to be the most successful. And the last thing that you would want is to avoid adopting something and then find out that that was really what consumers wanted. And that's now kind of the flagship product or service for that other company. So there's a lot of things that are happening here. You go into kind of e-commerce and you start talking about Amazon and Walmart, and obviously Amazon is the dominant player in e-commerce. There's should be no surprise when I say that. But then looking at some of the things that Walmart is trying to doing to better compete, you have some of the brick and mortar locations that are trying to leverage their physical stores for distribution. And so those are some things that are happening in the competitive environment. And so the key is to be aware of what your competition is doing, which could be difficult because we try to maintain some secret practices, obviously. You don't want to disclose everything, but being aware of what your competition is doing so that you can make an assessment if ultimately it matters. If you need to do anything about it, maybe not, but if you do, what does that look like? Is it offering a similar product or service, or merely repositioning something you already have? Unfortunately, you really can't make that change unless you're familiar with what's actually happening in the competitive environment. The next environment is the political and legal environment. And this includes any changes or trends with regards to legislation, regulations, and even court decisions that have the potential to affect a business in some way. Now, we know that the government does a whole lot. Some of that is maybe good for business. A lot of it is not necessarily. And so we have to be aware of what are those potential things that are happening that pose a risk to us so that we can adapt accordingly. Obviously, it's really difficult to affect government policy unless you're a well-established company with a lot of money to throw at lobbyists. But most companies don't have that same ability to do so. And so although we can take issues directly to consumers and hope that they kind of address grievances and those types of things and swaying legislation that way, it's not always a guarantee. And so many times we merely have to adapt to what is already happening. So one change or potential change that had a little bit of steam early on and seemed to kind of lose a little bit of momentum is the national minimum wage rate. And, a few years ago, this was a very, very big issue. President Obama kind of ran on this platform when he was up for re-election on raising the national minimum wage. Regardless of your opinion on whether or not it would really provide any benefit long term, there's two camps, of course. But regardless of that, you can't argue that it wouldn't have some type of impact on businesses that particularly hire low-wage workers, right? You deal with the increase immediately in your direct labor costs, which of course, potentially you pass along to consumers and everything like that. But that would be a potential change that could pose a risk to your business that you would have to be aware of so that you could adapt accordingly. And the last environment is the global environment. Now here we're focusing on a few different things, but mostly obviously international, and dealing with international economic conditions, natural disasters, and even political unrest in a society that spills over and affects your business. We live in a global economy, and so it isn't enough to merely consider what is happening domestically, but businesses also need to consider what is happening around the world, right? Everything from how a crisis in the Middle East affects the price of oil has the potential to impact businesses in some way, shape, or form. So one of the things that just happened recently within the last few days of this recording is the kind of conflict with the Ukraine and Russia. And you potentially, allegedly, Russia was sending in equipment and troops into the Ukraine. The Ukraine apparently fired upon them and caused some damage and those sorts of things. And if you were watching the stock market or the financial markets, those were very much so affected by that particular crisis. And so something that's happening all the way around the world for some people has the potential to affect what's happening back in the US and in other parts of the world as well. One big event that happened 2 years ago was the earthquake and subsequent tsunami over in Japan that caused damage to that nuclear reactor plant. I think it's the Fukushima Daiichi power plant, if I'm saying that correctly, hopefully. And that caused some really significant issues with suppliers. So I know, for example, in certain parts in the US, it was really difficult to get parts for Japanese-made automobiles because there were certain parts that were manufactured in Japan in that area that was affected and had a big impact on dealerships and body shops being able to get parts to actually repair vehicles here in the US. Once again, something that happens all the way across the world, but has the potential to impact people in the US and in other areas of the world as well. So from a business standpoint, what you need to consider is the probability of something like that happening, but also attempting to insulate yourself against those potential threats. So, maybe you can't predict when an earthquake is going to happen, but based upon precedent, know that it is a possibility. So what can you do to lessen the impact of such an event happening. So maybe that's diversifying suppliers where, you have things spread out between multiple suppliers in different areas so that if one is negatively affected, you still have operations and can pull supplies from another one. Could be a number of different things, but obviously you'd have to start looking at that issue to go ahead and adapt accordingly. So altogether, these 6 environments represent what we call the external business environment. So each of them has some potential impact on businesses, and it's up to us to go ahead and analyze them so that if we can identify some maybe opportunities for new products or services that we hadn't ordinarily thought of, or potentially identify threats that we have to respond to if we're going to maintain market share and all those other sorts of things. All right, that does it for this video on the external business environment. Hopefully you found that information to be helpful. If you want more information, feel free to go to alanisbusinessacademy.com. Also, make sure that you sign up for our email list where we send out periodic updates related to new lessons, podcasts, courses, other really important information that you might find useful. You can do that by going to alanisbusinessacademy.com/list, and feel free to check out some of our other podcasts and lessons that we have on the website as well. Thanks for watching, and we'll talk to you soon.